Meeting is being recorded.
Welcome, viewers, to this new episode of BeyondPhrenology. And today we are delighted to have with us Dr. Wim Pouw from Tilburg University, Netherlands. Wim is an assistant professor in the Department of Computational Cognitive Science, studying different aspects of movement and communication. His overall research program is about understanding how communication systems are forged through multi-scale interactions that become coordinated, which is functionally inclined in ways that allow for more novel, stable, adaptable, or more evolved communication to emerge. So basically, we're talking about complex human communication here. He has an expertise in looking at movements and speech together in ways that I don't think anybody did before Wilm started to do. He has training in ecological psychology background as well. He was working with Professor James Dixon at UConn at some point. Uh, So we have kind of shared interest here and with the audience. Though Wim is not so much tied to some of the premises and has been more exploratory and I would say bolder with his work. So Wim, welcome to Beyond Phrenology.
Yeah, thank you, Madhur. Also, very nice to meet you because we've never really met.
Mhm.
It's great to talk today. Yeah.
So Wim, would you like us to, listen more about your background, especially, what were the motivations where you started your academic journey, and what kind of ideas have shaped your current research program?
Yeah. Yeah, at first I have to say that I'm always a little bit sad that I don't have this kind of amazing origin story of,
Hmm.
of why I came into this field. I think I started, I didn't even know that I would end up at university. And then I followed my sister who studied psychology. But I think there was a negative force in me, like when doing psychology, that it seemed as if um, uh, we were talking about mind as some kind of abstract calculator. Um, and I think quite early on, I felt that the curriculum was kind of too abstract for the kind of things that I was interested in. As a psychology student, you're often interested in, I don't know, I guess your childhood and all that kind of those kind of
Hmm.
things. But I quite early in those studies, I came across. I think I came across Anthony Chamiro's work on radical embodied cognitive science. I didn't get anything of it. I read it, but and it felt it felt somehow to resonate. And so at the end of my psychology stint, I thought, hey, maybe I know that there are theoretical psychologists here in the department, and I know that I probably am an experimentalist. So I first did a research master where I kind of worked just on um, getting to grips with good experimentation, and but in psychology and social psychology. And then I did another master in theoretical psychology, and that was mostly focused on radical embodied cognitive science, uh, which I came across via the Radical Embodied Cognitive Science book by Anthony Chamiro. And um, specifically there, I think I had this idea that maybe one day I did want to become a philosopher, but I didn't. Also because I was also kind of slow. I'm a slow thinker, so I think it wouldn't be the best career for me. And anyway, so after a year of philosophy courses, mostly philosophy courses on embodied cognitive science and phenomenology, um, I I just accepted the first PhD that I thought had embodied cognition on the tin. I was quite aware that there are all kinds of different variants, but in that particular PhD, I was focused on problem solving, and most of the people who understood embodied cognition there, and everybody, whoever says they are aligned with embodied cognition, have a different sense of this, right? But
Hmm.
was more embodied simulation, so this focused more on the embodiment of concepts, more Barcelovian kind of grounded cognition. Um, so I operated more in that kind of field, and then tried to apply some of the things that I got more from radical embodied cognitive science into that kind of PhD. But I was also there kind of a slow. I was kind of slow, so I wasn't doing really technical much technical stuff, and I think I was still afraid to learn some things or pick up things by myself. So I think I could have done more in my PhD, to be honest. Although I had a great time, many friends that I still see, and I've learned also to be an academic there. I think now there's a distinction between being academics and doing science. I feel like we're being trained to be an academic quite well sometimes, but actually doing the science is a different thing. And I feel like there were great scientists there, but I just feel like I was still not there.
We should talk we should talk about this in more detail later, Yeah.
And I'll also wrap up a little bit. But okay, so I still had this kind of idea about radical embodied cognitive science, that I still wanted to do something with that at some point. So once I finished my PhD, I applied for a grant to work with James Dixon from CESPA. And the reason for this was that I think in Camara's book, one of the first papers they discuss is their kind of self-organization of insight paper, where they show that kind of these kind of gestures that people are making during problem solving as a kind of extended kind of problem solving routine. Actually, the kind of fluctuations that you see in movements are predictive for a major insight into seeing a new rule. That's so that I thought these are the people that are doing something where they can actually, in an experimental way, also make sense of embodied cognition. Because one thing that I think why I'm also not why I in the end would not be happy with philosophy on itself, I was also it is very difficult to do true, if you believe that the world is multi-scale, dynamical, non-linear, it's really difficult to do that science, especially if you're kind of a slow learner as me. I felt like I will never be at that level. Sorry, my cat will come here. I will never be at that level where I feel like I do the type of science that matches my ontology. So anyway, so I believe that at CESPA things were happening that aligned with a general ontology, and they had the methods to actually attack this. And so I got the grant. I was lucky enough to get the grant, and I actually wrote a grant on something that kind of cascaded into something completely differently, because it is there that we started to work on. We just started to look at gestures from an ecological perspective, and also from a movement science perspective. What do we know? And in this field where I was kind of, I inherited this field from gesture studies. That's why I also wrote that proposal, because that was my background. And at CESPA, I started to learn one thing. What I really started to learn is that you can pick up things yourself if you have a certain attitude towards learning, and there was a real culture there for doing things yourself and tinkering, and so that's something that for me was very important intellectually, to kind of be less afraid to start new things and learn new things and tinker. And another thing at CESPA is that I started to look at this phenomenon that I've been studying for a while from a completely different perspective. I wasn't thinking about gestures as muscles still, even though as a physical thing that could connect to how we make meaning. But we can talk a lot later what I mean by this. But so at CESPA I had a great intellectual time, 2 years. But for me, that all kind of started my more technologically savvy, more computationally grounded, and also more. I started to be less afraid to pick up things myself and do new things, and think about things outside of your literature. And this is something that is both a curse and a blessing, because now I know nothing of anything but a little bit of some things that I have a broad kind of interest. But yeah, I don't know. It is also I also feel like I'm still dabbling in all kinds of things, but not really. still that's one mood, an anxious mood they have.
Yeah.
And then I went back to the Netherlands in Nijmegen. I got a grant to really delve deeper into the things that I was doing at CESPA. I had a great time there, and then I was lucky enough to have a faculty position at Tilburg now for less than a year still. So it's quite new.
And do you see some differences between how you were trained in the US, or what kind of environment, academic environment, or when you said like learning to become an academic versus the academic environment or the science environment in Netherlands?
Yeah. If I look at it, like back at the time at the US, I really felt that people were they're living this being a scientist. There is much more. They put their whole livelihood in it, or at least many people do, and it has many risks, right? If you, I think, if you cherish something, it will eat your life. I think David Foster Wallace said something like this, right? That if something goes wrong or you get a rejection, and your whole life is this one thing that you're working on, well, it's going to destroy you. So I think it has many drawbacks. But I at that time, I really needed that people really felt like they were living that life, and they, I don't know. I was quite enamored by it. I don't know if I could have that pace for the rest. Well, I don't know. I think,
George Carlin used to say that the world is a freak show, and if you are in the US, you get the front row ticket. So, so one of the greatest things about the US is that, I mean, people just focus on what they like or what they are, passionate about, and the extent to which they are willing to sacrifice everything else for the sake of the passion, or for the curiosity or excellence, is just another level. I mean, it's hard to see that anywhere else in the world, and that's the beauty of being in the US or being trained in the US.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and I take this with me a little bit. So it stays with me. No, that's definitely something that I really appreciated. And it was exactly what I needed at the time, I think.
Right. I mean, you can email professors at Christmas Eve and you can expect a reply early morning next day. And if you do that to a professor somewhere else, especially in Europe, you get an instant reply that I'm on a vacation until 5th of January or something.
Yeah, definitely. And it has pros and cons, right? So,
Nice. So when you said, you touched upon a very interesting point of your experiments or your science true to your ontology, right? So all of us as scientists, especially if we are trained well theoretically, we have an ontology. And of course, that might change over time, with more readings or with basically transformation when you inherit new ideas. But we do have an ontology, at least, in neurosciences or cognitive sciences. And then you have the way you practice science, right? You design your experiments and things like that, right? And as you said, like the CESPA and the Connecticut group was very true to their ontology in terms of, what experiments they planned. But we also know that that might not be true for a lot of us, eventually because of grant pressure or because of academic, being an academic, we often lose our ontology, and basically our science and ontology deviates to an extent where they're unrecognizable. Can you elaborate a little more on that from your philosophical standpoint as well as from a practical standpoint of being an academic? Because you touched upon the idea that you are also learning to being an academic, which is often different than being a scientist.
I think you mentioned it yourself, right? So I think I am not perceived, and I don't identify myself as one of the most rigorous or most programmatic ecological psychologists, right? So I think the way that I've been writing things is, well, for most papers, I think I've kept it quite open for other people to be inspired, even though they have a cognitivist kind of background. And I think maybe that's part strategic, but part also because my ontology doesn't always have to shine through. Depends a little bit on the paper, right? I'm quite happy to sometimes do to take a stance. And it's so the same is when I wrote a grant, for example, I don't say non-representational, but I might say not yet representational. Or so I've been trained quite well to be an academic, which in those cases is try to present your results in a way that people with a potentially different ontology could work with something like that. So in that sense, I feel like I sound like a crappy salesman, but I think I'm just saying that as an academic, you're sometimes it's not bad to not always let your ontology shine through so vigorously that it kind of moves away from the findings that you might have that might be interesting. So I feel like for some of the things that we've been saying in, for example, gesture research, which we might touch upon, were quite radical. But I've never had the feeling that the people who didn't necessarily think about this phenomenon this way thought we were radicals. Whilst I think many fellow real committed ecological psychologists have often been waved away as radicals, right? Whilst in this fun little domain called gesture studies, I've only met people who are super open to the idea that there might be things like emergence of biomechanical interactions between arms and voice. And I've always been, in that sense, I don't feel like I've been as ridiculed as some ecological psychologists might feel that they have been in their particular field. So yeah, I'm digressing. But maybe to not come over as a crappy salesman, what I do think is that the work that I've been doing has silently aligned with a relational ontology, a process ontology, and I think maybe now, as I get older, I'm also a little bit happier to take a more stance on this. For example, written a recent paper on more really a 4E radical interpretation of iconicity, for example. And I don't think it's particularly novel or good, but at least I'm more happy to sometimes be more open about my ontology.
Yeah. I see. So, Wim, can you go a little more detail about what ontology we are talking about here, and what's the alternative ontology or alternative ontologies? What's a basic difference, and to what extent that ontology constrains or does not constrain, given that your work is fairly open. Cognitivists can also interpret in a cognitivist sense. So your ontology is not constraining the experimental design or the interpretation, right? It does inform the ideas, though, right? I would say a purely cognitivist stance will probably not lead you to the kind of experiments which you have designed, during your postdoc and lately. So could you elaborate on those ontologies and yeah.
Well, it's also a bad thing that often when we do this, that we start to do it in a negative. We start to say it in a negative way, things that we don't like. But that's the initial hunch that I have. So what I don't like is that we have some kind of understanding that, for example, in the case of self-produced movements that are part of some kind of semiotic utterance, that the idea is that we have some sense, we have some idea that gets represented in some kind of bodily utterance, and the idea is already formed. The only thing is that it needs to be transformed in some way, and that felt to me. And I think many people aligned with the 4E approach. I think Merleau-Ponty already said that that gesture does not represent anger; it is anger, for example, which is so my bodily gestures conveying anger. That's not the right way to think about it, as if there is some kind of prepackaged idea that then gets transformed or materializes in some way. I think the very thought materializes in its embodiment. And I think for the types of things that I've been doing in my field, I've tried to get a better understanding of how can we make that more understandable. If we take Merleau-Ponty's ontology about embodiment, that gesture is not a kind of a prepackaged materialization, but it is part of that very emergence of that anger process. I think that is something that I can get aligned with, and my results, I think, speak to this, right? So maybe it's good to allude to that already, in what ways I think that is the case. So we've been doing, there is this field in gesture studies which have been looking at why is it the case that when humans produce co-speech gestures, it's often well aligned. This especially, for example, if you're giving a presentation, you have these gestures that can have quasi-rhythmic aspects to it. They move with the rhythm of speech. They move with their accent, the accented speech. And the general idea has been in this line of cognitivist thinking, you have two modalities. They are doing things at the same time. So there must be something internally that does the timing, that connects these two things, that orchestrate these two things. Otherwise, it cannot be explained, right? And generally, the ecological move, if you're in a dyadic situation, you say, well, there is a reciprocal interaction. So that kind of obviates the need for a central controller. But in the case of self-produced actions, you might wonder, well, yeah, isn't it the case that if two modalities are not physically linked, there must be a controller? That's something that my colleagues, that's a type of reasoning that one enters in quite easily with the kind of training you have as a psychologist, right? And we started to do very simple things, and it was actually James Dixon, where I think we sat together at one of the meetings, and he said something. Well, do you know that, for example, there is this thing like a respiratory locomotor coupling, where you have, let's say, horses that when they increase their stride speed and go into gallop, for example, or galloping locomotor modes, they start to synchronize their synchronization with their locomotor strides. And this happens because they come off the ground, they land on their forefeet or the forelimbs, and the deceleration moves the organs against the respiratory system, which makes it so that the animal has a slight expiratory drift or an expiratory drive that makes it so that the animal could actually decouple it, but it doesn't make sense to do it. They have to breathe anyway. So why not align the expiratory drive from movement with the respiratory cycle? So also expire at that same time. And maybe you can actually do double duty. If you time it well enough, you can actually expire more easily and make use of the deceleration that you're producing during the land or the when you hit the ground. So that kind of thinking got us thinking, well, is it the case? We have the shoulder girdle. It's the shoulder girdle itself has a very interesting kind of anatomy, as you know. You just have the clavicular bone. It's just horizontally oriented. If you would push down, it's not great because you can easily break it. It's indeed one of the bones that we most often break. And how is it, if we just remove the muscle, our shoulder girdle would just fall down alongside our whole thorax. It's actually kept in place by a whole tensile kind of web-like structure with muscles and fascia or connective tissues. And that means that any movement that I'm making, I have a lot of co-contractions of other muscles. If I just have a simple arm movement, there are a lot of muscles that then make it so that this is a stable system. And it turns out that these muscles are wrapping around the thorax. And the thorax, if you move it ever slightly, you're going to have slight changes in subglottal pressures. So the glottis below, you have the pressures that determine how your voice kind of the voice dynamics, either F0 or primarily the intensity of the sound. So the idea is that similarly like the horse that aligns a certain biomechanical kind of inhomogeneity or asymmetry, we align this. If we have a movement, there is no reason to not align this in a way that it also aligns with my let's say, I don't believe in these targets, but a prosodic target where you say, I find this important, the moment that my intensity increases, there is a natural biomechanical alignment to also produce a muscle action that has a slight compressive effect on the thorax. And I think we've been doing a lot of studies to show whether we show that at least simple arm movements affect the voice. It affects the voice through, we have measured muscle activity, that certain muscles like an internal rotation activates the pectoralis major, the chest muscle, and which then also increases the intensity of your voice, and you can directly couple it to the amount of muscle activity you obtain during these movements. Well, anyway, so if we unpack this back to the ontology, so we have here a system where the communication system is structured in a certain way that could be seen as arbitrary, could just be seen as some kind of thing we do because culturally they kind of sedimented their way in, and I think that's true. But it's what has been sedimented has actually been a slight kind of asymmetry in the biomechanical stability of doing these things, and which means that it makes more sense, and I mean that in an embodied, skillful way. It makes more sense to gesture and vocalize in a aligned or coherent way. So for me, this is completely what I liked about it, at least in this small little kind of niche phenomenon. What I liked about it is that there's no. This for me is an example of the radical embodied cognitive science I was kind of enamored with, or that I thought it would be so cool if I find the right methods to show this. For me, this loops completely outside of the brain. We need to really rethink what starts first and how can we. I think it's. Really need to rethink. You need to have some kind of circular causality here about how biomechanical stabilities interacts with stabilities in neural regimes, and so for me this could have semiotic implications that communication. There is this. It could have been different. But the reason that we just have a slight biomechanical nudge to do it in a particular way, and that the rest gets sedimented around that, or is used for and enculturated, and I think it also has I haven't really, to be honest, I never have really been able to express it well, but I feel like these kind of biomechanical stabilities might have meaning that comes for free, or is some kind of way for animals, but also cross-species communication to understand each other in a fundamental way. That we can hear voice. We don't hear abstract voices. We hear embodied voices, and I think this is something that ties into that. I have the feeling that there is something special about this kind of communication.
So I think it's a really good example of radical embodied cognitive science. I mean, if you look at the word radical, it is radical. Embodied, it definitely is embodied, and it is cognitive science. I mean, it's probably one of the best examples of cognitive science, radical embodied cognitive science. What would be a cognitivist interpretation? I mean, can you discuss a little bit of results of what you found and specific? So let's say your speech voice coupling paper in PNAS, right? So could you elaborate a little bit on the results? And now ontology is very clear, right? Like looking at that coordination is very much tied to the ecological embodied ontology. But now, what would be the ecological interpretation of that? Of course, it's a little clear. But how would a cognitivist interpret? And then it's very clear that what you're trying to do is basically chipping away some of the burden which you are giving to brain, right? A lot of burden can be chipped away to externalities, to the organism and environment, as well as to the organismal capacities as well. Like for instance, in this case, the clavicular, the bones the fascia, the tendons and the thorax, and and for instance, coordination of the whole event, as you said, in case of horses galloping and timing the breathing with that, right? Which we also see in humans. Cardiorespiratory coupling with locomotion is also a real thing in humans, and you see more and more in sports, in running. And one of the things in coaching, and for instance, good coaching and good running practice is basically to time all these rhythms so that you can kind of utilize all these embodied contingencies much more efficiently, as opposed to struggling with them.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So I think there are a couple of. Maybe I'm not completely. I wasn't completely reflecting all moods that people might have about this particular phenomenon. So I think there are some colleagues of mine who say, okay, you
Hmm.
might show that there is some relationship between arm movements and the muscles that you use, and the way that it constrains the rib cage, which affects the respiratory focal system. But it might just be a perturbation, noise, or something. So it is um, uh, um, something that, which is good. It challenges this research program that you might want to actually show that depending on how um, how a speaker, for example, aligns or controls this, is something that you might want to show, right? So there is, there is now the most recent study that we've been working on actually looks at, well, if people intend at a certain moment to have a higher intensity and a higher F0 because you accent something in this speech,
Hmm.
it's called a contrastive focus. So and you're doing the same gesture, or a similar kind of setting, but you actually are stressing or accenting another word. Uh, we have been actually seeing, and we're writing this up, that Shuguang Sheng, and my student, is writing this up, um, that we actually, even if we're producing the gesture at a moment when we actually don't need this expiratory drive, even for the same gesture, people slightly decrease the muscle activity that they use for that gesture because it's
Hmm.
not in alignment with their targets.
Hmm.
Um, and it seems that the degree to which they decelerate still couples slightly, or still couples with their intensity for that particular syllable. But when it's not aligned, when you should have a contrastive focus on something else, it actually seems that people start to compensate because we see this attenuation of the relationship between that muscle and the intensity. We have all kinds of other inspiratory muscles that we could kind of use at the same time to uh, stably keep focalization relatively stable when we move our arms. So depending on what we want to do, we either let it emerge, and I think this letting it emerge is feels more coherent. I think also communicates a certain coherence of my body when I move in alignment with my focalization, I think. Um, but we have control.
Hmm.
Um, so I think that the reason why I'm saying all this is that I think people who think the research is skewed, they think, okay, but there needs to be a central controller that kind of allows this perturbation, or why, and that's
Hmm.
one thing, what controls it, and another is maybe it's just a noise, maybe it's just a perturbation, and
Hmm.
um, yeah, so I think these are fair. These are in some moods. I also think it's a small little effect, perhaps. I think
Hmm.
these small little biomechanical instabilities. It's like a pearl, right? You have this one kind of small little piece of sand, and
Hmm.
in the enculturation process, or over evolution, I would say, these small inhomogenities uh, in biomechanical stabilities make it so that communication is driven in a certain direction. So I think the holy grail in this kind of research is really showing how the system controls it and aligns these different kind of multi-skill processes together.
Mm-hmm.
And then at some point, you also want to consider what does it mean if our gestures are aligned semantically as well, right? So some
Mm-hmm.
gestures
Yeah.
make more sense with the things that you are saying, the
Mm-hmm.
context, they would say. And I would say that see that as another multi-scale level. And I would, if I would have the time, I think that you could further build this out, how alignment between these multi-scale processes, if you tap into the system, that misalignment and alignment and instabilities, and I think you could capture a lot about when something feels off or something is produced in a way that things are not aligned. I think you can tap into several levels of the system and detect that already. Yeah, and so anyway, so I think it's one thing showing clearly that there is some biomechanical link, such that some actions produce muscle activations that are related to ribcage movements. It's quite another thing how it's incorporated in natural full sentence speech, right? So I think there's still much to do, and I think that is it's difficult work, I think, but I
Yeah.
think now Xu Guangcheng's recent study, I'm really enthused about this because I feel like it's an important nail, a nail in the coffin of the idea that this is just something that we kind of deal with as a nuisance. Yeah.
I'm just getting curious, like we wear so many clothes and coats and suits and whatnot. I'm wondering if our ancestors, who were living naked, generally speaking, had better communication because the gestures were so more apparent, including, the rhythms of breathing and things like that.
Yeah, for certain. Yeah, I think I think there is a reason why people sometimes want to go back in those bodily moods and
Yes.
dance excessively. Or I think, I do have the feeling that there is something also for cross-species communication, right? How
Yeah.
is it even possible that we have some sense of other animals uh, um, mental well-being? Or I think that kind of the potential for cross-species understanding, I think, relates a lot to these kind of stabilities that we know quite well, or that we have
Yes.
experienced ourselves quite well.
Mm-hmm.
And that we have also done studies at CESPA with Alexandra Paxton. She also we started to talk. Hey, can people actually perceive, for example, the movements that people are producing during vocalizations? If people are rhythmically moving and vocalizing at the same time, you have listeners listening to that sound. Do they actually have some kind of intuition about where the movement is in that cycle, for example?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the BNS paper um, uh, that shows that people actually, if they listen to people's voices, they don't hear this abstract sound, right? They actually know quite well where the movement facing is of the particular vocalizer who is moving. So
Yeah.
it kind of drives home this point, that we don't hear abstract sounds.
Mm-hmm.
We
So,
hear acoustic information about bodily states and processes.
so this kind of so you mentioned in the beginning that you were inspired by the the cognitive insight and movement article, right? Probably it's an article by Damien, right? Damien
Yeah,
and
yeah,
Dixon,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Kelly, Stephen, and Dixon, or
yeah,
Stephen and Dixon at that point.
yeah,
So, and he also has several articles on strong anticipation, right? Where
yeah,
you offload prediction, because you have certain kind of structure within a sequence of tapping or within a sequence of stimulus, right? So do you think that in gesture and speech, or in uh, you know interpersonal coordination,
mm,
or any conversation, basically, there's a less of a predictive load because again your coordination is already taking care of those
yeah,
anticipatory gestures, so you don't need to basically predict the gesture. It's kind of tied in the biomechanical and or constraints of interactions themselves.
yeah, yeah. I So I think here, for example, in turn taking, there is a big literature on turn taking, and the kind of cognitivist general understanding is it happens. Our mean latencies are 200 milliseconds, and then they have this example. Well, if I show you an apple and you have to say whether it's an apple or a pear, you're going to take 800 milliseconds. So how is it the case that I can somehow time my launch of my turn with respect to yours within 200 milliseconds? And they say this must be prediction. And I think it's fine to call it prediction whenever something happens before or slightly after something happens. Maybe it's fine to use it as a definition, but often you get all kinds of machinery that something is being predicted through some kind of model that tries to predict some state of affairs that are now absent, but they're literally present as you go as you are starting to end your turn. For example, your prosody tapers off. You already have information. It's like it's not so different than catching a fly ball. You if you tune into the right informational variables, you're literally seeing into the future, right? You're seeing the future. We see that you're going to end your turn, and somehow that's also, I think that's a typical case of ontology where people say, okay, you predict somebody, we need to do prediction. Well, you could also say that you perceive the turn ending, and since I perceive the turn ending, I will launch my turn. Well, the general idea is that we predict the turn ending, and we do this with all kinds of cognitive machinery that is needed to go beyond state of affairs. I don't necessarily think that the biomechanics feeds into this, or the biomechanics of gesture speech coupling feeds into that necessarily, but it's one of those examples with turn taking that I think, oh yeah, it's interesting that how that generally is framed.
Yeah. So this has been, a pattern with computational neuroscience, right? That computational cognitive science is that whenever you have an exception to the rule, right? So, for instance, in this case, we know from neurophysiology that it would take about 800 milliseconds, to respond, but now you're seeing ultra fast responses in 200 milliseconds or even less, and now you have to invoke a concept so that you keep your 800 millisecond constraint intact, right? Rather than maybe that's not the constraint on this particular kind of behavior,
Yeah.
right? So you keep on calling these auxiliary hypotheses or auxiliary mechanisms.
Yeah, yeah. I've never seen it like this. That they try to protect a certain kind of concept of that I react to the world with a certain delay or something,
Yeah.
and that's something that they try to kind of maintain, or that ontology they try to maintain, and then they set up the situation as if you're predicting the turn ending. Yeah. Um, yeah, I think there you see that there are different kind of radically different perspective that kind of also makes people talk alongside each other rather than having a meaningful conversation sometimes. But
Right. And my head is going all sorts of ways, like what if you're tipsy, you're a little drunk, and then what happens to your coordination then? I mean, there's so much you can tap into the neurophysiology as well, uh,
yeah,
you
yeah.
know, and make it actually embodied claims rather than, internal models all the time.
Mhm. Yeah, maybe I didn't have a chance to read your paper yet on the scale of action, or how can you define an action depending on it's a category error, I believe. I also have the feeling with these kind of things, so it depends on scale, right? We if we look at the scale at which we react to individual stimuli, then things might look like that. But how do they look like in an extended conversation?
Right.
And then the situation changes. And what is turn taking there? Turn taking there could be read. It could be is not what you doesn't work on the same levels, or I don't know if it connects with your. But yeah. Yeah.
So how do you, right? So for instance, so how do you build upon your work? I mean, of course, you have been, you put out fascinating pieces with some really amazing figures. But how do you decide your next questions? Like, uh, uh, given that not you are not a neurophysiologist, you are not a physiologist, right? You are. in some way a behaviorist, right? Still, so what informs your next questions? Or let me ask in a different way. Like what kind of scales of uh, of basically the organism are you trying to traverse or would like to limit yourselves to?
Hmm.
And within that scale, what determines, what next questions do you ask? Well, it's very easy to go through scales because I start with behavior and now I'm interested in, the role of this part of the brain, that part of the brain, or the role of muscles and the physiology, and you can easily kind of manipulate each of those in certain ways and try to make you know, some causal link or some, link of necessity and things like that. But when you remain at a particular level of analysis, especially as a behaviorist or as an observer, then it's much harder to go into deeper of the level of the organisms. And then you have to ask deeper questions about coordination or the deeper questions about how that links to something else.
Yeah.
And then how you think about the next questions are very two different kind of enterprises.
Yeah. I think I would like to do more scales at some point. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm happy that I didn't start as a neuroscientist, but I would like to at some point dabble into in it. Um, but if you so I would be looking for new skills to kind of incorporate it. But I think what I've learned, even though I would call myself ecologically inspired rather than an ecological psychologist, is
Mm-hmm.
that maybe try what is quite productive for a researcher that has to remain happy as they run this marathon, right? Is that
Mm-hmm.
you might want to have one research line that builds up from first principles.
Yeah.
And you might just need to be lucky to find something like this. And for me, it was just people doing simple movements. And it turns out that the voice is reacting to this. And then we have started to build this out slowly and slowly into something that we could measure better, where we could get better at the causal, figuring out the causal structure. And now we're releasing that into more semiotically meaningful, but still rehearsed speech.
Mm-hmm.
And you build it out, you build out the complexity bit by bit. That's it's a lot of work, and it also goes slow maybe for the times that we're now used to kind of figure it start big or something.
Mm-hmm.
But this one research line um, kind of builds things up slowly, and every new question for me naturally follows out of these out of each of these series of experiments. So now we have done finally we've done a study where we carefully measure ground reaction forces. We have for to get at the postural role of these destabilizing arm movements. And we've looked at the muscle activations rather than only, for example, ribcage kinematics. And now a natural move for us for people who are interested in this research line is trying to unleash that little kind of simple causal structure into something that has a that has semiotics in it. It has different goals in it. So you start to unleash it a little bit in something that is is much more complex.
Mm-hmm.
So that for me that naturally trickles out. And then I have other research line where I can be a little bit more explorative, and also I feel like there it's a little bit less principled. But I can
Mm-hmm.
live with this because I have this one research line at least that I've been cherishing, and we've been doing most studies there are pre-registered, and we really take our time with most of these things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, whilst there are other more exploratory questions that, for me, that kind of fits my personality. That I'm also interested in a lot of other things. So I've been interested in looking more at comparative. Other species. So we've been collecting a data set in the zoo on siamang apes who sing and move at the same time, and we've been using some of these tools that are now quite widely available to do some motion tracking from video, for example.
Mm-hmm.
We've been looking at how movement and vocalization couple, also still from this kind of idea that there are biomechanical interactions of also for these animals which move at incredible speeds while they sing.
Mm-hmm.
They have a super optimized shoulder girdle, which kind of they they move in a very smooth way, so you don't have maybe as much perturbations as the clumsy humans who gesture maybe in violent ways. But in any way, so that's something that is more peripheral, and then that is more explorative. And there are some projects that kind of you also need to the patients you need for this one research line is also some patients that I wouldn't have to only focus on.
Right.
I don't know if this really answers your question. How do you do this?
That's a question of like how to be an academic. So like I'm a very moody person, so I cannot do anything which is against my mood because that like my kind of head explodes and so I get into these zones of coding, zones of writing, zones of thinking, right? And I have to switch gears. So given that I know myself and my constraints that so part of my job is to cater to my mood so I can stay productive, which means that I have to run multiple lines of work, just like you. But I'm more a tactical person than a strategic person. So in the sense that, my research lines are more about I have some writing projects going on, which are basically exploring the ontology, the philosophy, and lately about what has been wrong according to me, in cognitive neurosciences. What's the way forward? Uh, then you have this simulation work, which is basically hardcore coding and data generation and analysis work, especially with Damien and my colleague in Japan, which is a very different kind of work where we are still at the exploratory stage of what when we collect data in the universe, like we get these patterns. We associate those patterns to the physiology or to the system which we study, but a lot of those patterns are not system specific. A lot of those patterns are much universal. Whether you are studying stars or you are studying sand or you are studying organism, you see similar patterns, right? So what kind of processes can actually create those patterns and what those similarity actually mean?
Mm,
So that's that work, and then the work in the lab, basically collecting data on humans, which is more clinically driven right now. It used to be much basic science driven, but given the constraints of running a lab and having PhD students get paid and we all right. So I was initially also interested in useful work, but it was not very aligned. It used to be more exploratory, but now the work is more aligned towards a target of delivering technologies or delivering uh, rehabilitation outcomes, because only then can uh, it be funded. But now I'm also realizing only then it can be actually structured well, because when you are into completely exploratory stage, sometimes you miss the structure which is needed to go to
mm,
depths. And those funding constraints, in some ways, which I did not like initially, are also helping to align things, lately. So it's there. I keep my students away these days from a lot of exploratory work because it's very hard to have accountability on exploratory work. So I want them to be technically very proficient first, because technical proficiency leads to generation of new ideas. Because once you know what you can do, uh, you can think much broader. So my students are mostly focusing on building technical skills and executing the ideas which are already fully formed. Uh,
mm.
Currently. But we do once in a while, explore things. With regard to exactly the question I asked you, how do you choose the next one? I mean, it's very easy to ask that question as an interviewer, and I now you have put me on that spot. It's very difficult to formalize it because we all know it's a very non-linear process, and it's not a singular scale process. Like sometimes writing a discussion just leads to a new idea of a particular paper,
Mm.
or sometimes an idea needs like basically two three different exploratory studies, and finally once you're done with it, like now know what you can do next. um,
Yeah,
uh,
you're also drawn in about by a lot of colleagues who make you think about things differently,
yeah,
right?
right.
I have many colleagues and experts in their domains that
uh,
I somehow came across, or people I have the pleasure to train, for example, that make me think about these things quite differently. And before we know it, we're trying to figure out. Yeah.
And, during my PhD, when I was not that, I wasted a lot of time during my PhD. To be honest, like I was neither an academic nor a scientist for a lot of time during my PhD, although it was a fast PhD, 4.5 years. But I still feel that I could have done much more and learned much more. And one of my nightmare used to be that what if I run out of ideas? And every time I do a study, right, I'll be scared to death. Like, what if I don't get an idea for the next 2 years, right?
Yeah.
And that would that would stress me out, initially. But as you grow, you realize that you are not limited by the ideas, but actually by the ability to execute, both in terms of the funding as well as in terms of the human capacity to basically execute those ideas.
Yes, a weird flip. There's a weird flip somewhere where
Those are
you.
weird flips sometimes, right? And that's when like now you are an academic. Okay, now you're a scientist. So now I have more data coming in than I can actually handle. I have, more student questions than I can answer and more open projects that I can actually finish. Right? But at that time, this used to be a nightmare. Like, how will I search for new ideas? But I still feel that those ideas, if you don't give it a more conscious, a more deliberate thinking, they rot because things are related. And sometimes you need to just get off. And I do myself, I just need to get off all the work and I just need to read. So there are days, probably at least one day a week, or at least sometimes, a week at a time, where I'm just in a reading mode and I just voraciously read random things, literature, non-literature, science. And I think that reading helps me to basically kind of reset, the current ideas or basically make them kind of pad together, fill up some space, and then think out a little fresh. And that's when
Yeah.
I delve into venture out into reading completely new kinds of literature rather than reading the same people or the same journals.
Yeah, and even if I have it, even for sometimes I am down or I'm like in a bad mood for let's say a couple of weeks, and
Uh-huh.
you think why am I so invested in this activity, and
Uh-huh.
then I start reading again, and
Uh-huh.
then that mood kind of disappears. So for me, the reading is also the regaining sometimes some joy or
Yeah.
joy in things you're doing, um, and see meaning in this kind of
Right.
absurd activity of ours. I find.
So we
Uh,
have adopted AI, for instance, for everything. We are very voracious user of AI. But one thing which I never use AI for is reading. Because when I
yeah,
read, I need to read the authors. I don't want a summary. I mean, even if the book is mostly fluff, there are some parts, but that fluff is basically like the junk DNA. I need that
mm,
fluff between ideas to basically being able to think. I don't need a bullet list of ideas. I need to read what has come out of like an embodied human being while writing.
yeah, yeah. I agree. Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
Bill, so if people ask you like, why do you do this kind of work, right? Or what's the use of this kind of work? I mean, we always get asked this question, right? Like, why are you getting paid to do this? And why should we pay you to do this in the lab and hire students and all the instruments? So generally, what's your question? What's your answer to that question?
Yeah. Um, I think when I first started, I didn't care about this question. For some reason, I thought
Mm-hmm.
I am in this absurd role, and I will accept this absurd. I think it was absurd. I wasn't, for example, I wasn't. I was from a family that didn't have any much education, and they always thought it was kind of absurd what I did. I
Mm-hmm.
kind of just embraced the absurdity. I think it's even absurd to ask what it's for or something.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and now I think I'm looking at that quite differently. So I'm trying to see whether there are ways to align my some of the values that I have with the research that I'm doing. So I've been trying to look. I'm not very successful yet, but I've been applying for grants to do some more applied things. For example, we have found in one of our studies, a recent study that Marijn Hafkamp led, is that we in our lab we had these EMG measurements, but we also had heart rate that kind of sometimes you want to filter out when you do muscle or EMG analysis. And the heart is quite close to the. It's just quite close to the lungs, so it's also there's a kind of a vacuum-filled pericardium, and it just moves, right? And the left lung is there are only two lobes. It's a little bit smaller just to make space for the heart, right? And so we found that we thought we were the first, but it was not at all. It turns out that in the 80s, it was already found that the heart leaves a signature on vocalization. So if I would sing, for example, at a steady tone, you see that there are these slight increases both in F0, but more primarily in the intensity of the sound, with small kind of peaks in your vocalization that are aligning with the pulses of your systolic phases of your heart.
Wow.
And on the one hand, I thought, okay, we thought we were the first. We thought, this is incredible. We were actually, instead of putting the gain on the filter to get the heart rate out, we amplified it. And because we're measuring the pectoralis major more or less right on the heart, we had a good signal. And we find that the heart also has a small perturbation on the voice, where if you would do just as an FFT on these little dips, it would be the same as the FFT on the ECG, so on the heart electrical signal. And so we've been we have this nice little finding, and I started to think, well, okay, how could we okay, and it turns out that in the 80s there was this Orlikov had 3 studies actually showing this already in the 80s. Then the whole acoustic phonetics or physiological acoustic phonetics field, this would be in their field. They didn't really study that anymore after this PhD of Orlikov. But the only people who actually did something with it or related were the medical machine learning crowds that were using like 1,000 features like MFCCs, like abstract acoustic features, to detect or predict heart rate from just fluent speech, for example, in humans, and they're doing quite well. So they had some successes in actually predicting heart rate from the voice. And they don't really care so much what the mechanism or how it's even possible. The machine learning model is also picking up on whether there's a male or a female typical voice. So there you can predict the baselines a little bit, but there might also be information of the kind of mechanical impulses that Orlikov was picking up on in the 80s. But okay, so there. I actually there's one lesson that I think is very interesting. So once the non-machine learning people, so the people who are interested in the mechanisms, kind of stop, that whole research kind of stopped. We still don't know exactly what the physiological mechanism is. There are multiple. It could be a cardioballistic effect where the heart pushes on the lungs. It could be that vascularization in the voice that kind of changes the vocal tract, and which affects the voice. We don't really know, right? And we've done a study to look at. We think it's it's on the level of the respiratory system. But anyway, since there is no mechanistic literature, there is no literature on other non-human species of this effect. For example, what if you can have a wild call of a gibbon that is really difficult to catch, but you have an estimate of their heart rate variability or whatever, right? If we know that in humans we have some capability already to have non-invasively a heart rate detector based on the vocalization, we're now kind of discovering or seeing whether we can use it, for example, in monitoring in the bioindustry, whether if you have a pig that vocalizes or squeals and that can take multiple seconds, if you can non-invasively detect heart rate from it, could be valuable maybe at some point. So that's one of the things. So I'm looking for these kind of things that might have potential for. And I generally am worried about the suffering of animals, so I try to align that a little bit. But maybe now working on a grant where we could look at pigs in farming context and the vocalizations that they do, and then more there is other stuff that I try to. Just look more at, for example, how we publish papers in terms of the big publishers and trying to see whether we could try to make a move to retake control of the scholarly publishing system by doing more ourselves. So looking at diamond open access. So I've been trying to do more things that align with my values. But I think if you would answer have that question quite earlier in my career, I thought, well, I think it's absurd and just embrace absurdity. Don't bother me.
No, but I mean, this is like, when like, grandmother says like, oh, it seems like she's singing by her heart. I mean, we have heard this phrase before, right? Like somebody was singing by their heart or speaking by their heart, right? So it seems like there's some truth to that, right?
Yeah,
That you can.
You definitely. I think there's much more to discover here. And again, it's another multi-scale element of the voice. Its noise structure turns out to be kind of have as its origin some kind of multi-scale sources. And again, it's a small effect, but you can detect it reliably if people vocalize steadily. The machine learning community can train CNNs, for example, to detect it on fluent speeds to I think 8 BPMs confidence, which is not great, but good.
I mean, this is the reason, the Alexa sounds so much not real.
Yeah.
Right, Alexa? Alexa, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for asking. Running at optimal digital capacity and ready to tackle whatever you throw my way. What's on your mind today?
See, there's no heart, right?
Yeah. I wonder whether we can detect it. Yeah, it's I don't necessarily, I wouldn't put a lot of money on it, but yeah, it is there. It is in its small little way. The voice literally entrains to your heart, and I think it's kind of poetic and beautiful.
Yeah. No. I mean, that's the beauty of science, right? You discover these poetic and beautiful things, once in a while, and kind of keeps you do the toil.
Yeah, and what I really loved is I can imagine that in some moods we would be really sad to find that somebody else in the 80s has thought about this. But the whole story that some person worked on this for a little bit intensively, 4 studies, and people kind of forgot. I know some of my mentors in acoustic phonetics that I often go to if I have a question, they didn't really know about it. But we kind of forgot about it. And there was one field that doesn't really care about the mechanisms, just prediction. We have quite some successes, but they never really cared about what is.
I mean, this often happens, like you discover papers from 50s, 60s, 70s, some obscure paper, and they have that insight, but they never continued that work, or nobody basically picked on it, probably because of access to literature and whatnot. And now you see like you get an initial little disappointment, but at the same time you also feel like, oh, so that means that I'm right. I mean, like if you're rediscovering that phenomena even after 40 years, but still it's something robust.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. It feels like it's not just some kind of measurement work or something, which you could write it up to. Maybe I was more readily willing to say, well, maybe there is some contamination between these two sensors, right? Between the microphone. I mean, it's a complicated setup, so yeah.
Right. And also, I mean, I'm wondering, how many more patterns machine learning basically has identified, which basically point towards a mechanism that we do not yet understand, but we do have value to understand. So, because a lot of these, machine learning models are basically fairly agnostic to the mechanism, and it's more like throw everything, in the mix and see what you can find. And a lot of things are legit, and a lot of things are just.
Yeah, for example, in this case, the machine learning community has been using acoustic features. That if it's really the case that it's more a subglottal source, so there might be some changes in the pressure of the lungs, you would predict a certain range acoustic values in the lower frequencies to be affected, but they're taking a bunch of values that are mechanistically not informed. So of course, I would say it doesn't really matter. I mean, the CNN will just fit a complex function to it and downweight the things that it doesn't need. But for understanding, it's really, I feel like it was really a pity that it just stopped and some other field took over and already started applying it. Whilst I think it's a little bit of a kumbaya kind of story, but I think these fields need to work together to do productive things. Yeah, and I feel like it could have a potential then for other fields that are interested in well-being or physiological care of animals. And
So, Wim, what are the current projects in your lab? Some of the projects which you can, tell us a little about.
Yeah, so I feel like I'm a little bit in a transition. So I at Nijmegen at the Donners Institute, we had set up and we had the equipment to do the EMG measurements, to do the postural measurements, and but I moved to Tilburg, which also meant more teaching for me. So I've been focusing a lot on teaching, or 60% teaching, which has been a lot of fun. I've been learning a lot and enjoying it. But I feel like maybe this is a moment for me to kind of step back a little bit and see what would be my next step. So I feel like now I'm using this a little bit to take a step back in terms of what I want to do next. And I feel like I wonder whether I still want to continue this more precise muscle measurement. I think I want to see whether we can extend it, we can make targeted predictions about more natural types of communication. I would like to keep on working with people who see some cross-species connections between how sound and movements, how they might interrelate and structure communication. I've been working with people, for example, on certain parrot species. I still have this data set on siamang that I really want to keep looking at. I've been very happy to work with a super talented PhD student, Sharka Kadafa, who is focusing more on the question, what is the meaning of effort in our communication? And she's been kind of going beyond the type of research that I've been doing, for example, doing inverse kinetics and looking at OpenSim. She's really moving things further. So I've been enjoying just watching somebody moving things further and knowing more than me. And that has been quite an joyful thing. And then I've been focusing more also on open science. So we have this open science platform in Visionbox that kind of embodies this kind of thing that I learned at CESPA, to do things your own, start tinkering. And this is like a good starting point for students to it's a website where you have all kinds of open data sets in the domain of multimodal communication. It will have tools to, for example, do automatic gesture detection, and we have tutorials on there. And it's something that also takes quite some time to do that well. So I feel like I'm zooming out a little bit, working on community things, a little bit more valorization. Then there's, like you said, there's a lot of data that we've collected that I still think will do a lot for this work on the what we call gesture speech physics. And I also think what I don't like is that the gesture speech physics, there are certainly good papers out there. For example, recent Momsen and Colson has showed that gravity matters for gestures and it aligns with our way of thinking. But a lot of the studies that we've, if I would now need to know them by heart, are done by me or colleagues, or I think at some point maybe you also want to hope that some people will work on this kind of stuff, but not you. Maybe it would also be better for the research program, I think, if people.
Yeah, so I mean, we get into these hyper specializations, right? Where you are one of the 4 peoples in the world, one of the 4 people, doing this work, and Yeah, you want you uh, you want more memes like you.
Sorry?
I mean, I was thinking of, I just started thinking of Dawkins, the selfish gene,
Mm,
like
yeah.
in a mimetic way, right? You just want more
Mm,
replicates of
yeah.
you or more people similar like you in some ways. Uh, there's
Yeah.
always this desire to see more work or uh, yeah, I mean, you don't want to be alone, basically.
Yeah, yeah,
You
and
know?
actually there are now new things coming out
Uh-huh.
where people are writing about the role of the vestibular system and how that relates to maybe the impulses that we create
Hmm.
during our movements, and there's certainly cool new stuff that I'm very excited about. But I'm also excited about yeah, that you don't feel alone in this kind of way of seeing, and I
Hmm.
don't think I was the only one, right? So I'm just
Yeah.
saying it was for some reason it was quite unique
Uh-huh.
uh, to be a human or to follow a human movement science kind of approach to this kind of behavior
Hmm.
uh, in this little niche, right?
Hmm.
And I think I've been inspired by many people who have worked, Linda Smith, or um, um, there are many people who have inspired me to do this. So I
Yeah.
don't want to so as if I was the only one, but I'm just
Right.
saying sometimes, or at least this particular kind of line of research feels like it's too much dominated. It has been quite dominated by a certain amount of people, and I hope
Uh-huh.
it diversifies. So I wouldn't be too
Yeah.
sad to leave it at some
Uh-huh.
point in my life.
No, it's also, this desire to share that joy of finding, right? So when you discover something, you realize like how many people can actually see the beauty of that and can, wonder or jump with you. And
Yeah, yeah,
sometimes it's such a minutiae that you feel that there will be very few people. You have to explain so much before somebody can jump with
yeah,
excitement.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, and one other thing, and what's what I genuinely admire about your research line is that
Yeah.
I also want to reserve some more time to go back to theoretical psychology, at least if not if just for myself, because I enjoy it a lot. So I've been
Uh-huh.
writing. I'm thinking about some more theoretical psych kind of
Hmm.
topics that I really want to write about.
Hmm.
Um, so that's one thing that I kind of set as a goal for myself,
Hmm.
uh, to take more time to do the theoretical stuff, which is kind of I need to be careful because I've of course just been hired as at a computational cognitive science.
That's so ironic though, yeah. Of course. I mean, I never asked that question. I mean, as when I was like, telling the audience that you are in the assistant was in the computational cognitive science, I was like, wow. So I'm pretty sure like I won't be hired in any computational department, most likely. Okay, if I apply, because because of some of the articles lately I published. But yeah, I mean, theoretical neuroscience, or I mean, I don't mean like theoretical modeling, but the theoretical ontology of neuroscience and cognitive sciences, as well as the sociology, are very very interesting.
What do you mean?
I mean, you realize that how much of this neuroscience and how much is the ontology and the way we think is constrained by the sociology of how the scientific enterprise works, how the training systems work,
Yeah,
how the grants work, and what kind of constraints they impose, and what kind of theories go, what kind of science we do. And
yeah,
once you
yeah.
realize that, you see like a lot of this is actually not planned; it's just emergent out of this current system. I have a lot of rant against a lot of computational neuroscience and the internal model and representational frameworks, and how much they can get away with. And
Yeah,
then when
yeah,
you
yeah.
see like, but 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 you have to give it like they cater to how sociology works. I mean, they are very sociologically friendly frameworks,
Yeah.
right? And they have good synonyms. So, for instance, we all were accustomed with computers since our childhood. At least our generation. Uh, and we knew the parts, and at some point in schools you were taught like these are the parts of the computer, right? Maybe right now kids might not know what is a RAM and what is a hard drive, or how a processor accesses the RAM versus the hard drive, and why do you need to have two different drives basically. But at some point, we were taught all these details, right? And when you see these details, and we were also given the analogy, it's like executive memory, or it's like the computer science class used to have analogies from the brain and human nervous system or cognition, and the psych classes and neuroscience would have the analogies from the computer, right? Uh, so we were growing up with this technology which was so accessible, uh, and that could allow us to have these synonyms or metaphors, right? Uh, uh, m- and now when you look at the ecological embodied ideas, where are those sticky metaphors? Those sticky metaphors don't exist.
Yeah.
And given how we think, given how we communicate, there are no metaphors to share.
Yeah, that resonates. Yeah, I'm also thinking about the Ingold, the anthropologist, writes about this that we're kind of used now because of having text as a common mode of communication.
Mm-hmm.
That we have some form of communication where there's always something behind the actual.
Mm-hmm.
There's always something that's being conveyed by the text. And he makes this point that in the early days, probably when we heard somebody speaking it, you don't have this immediate ontology that there's something behind it. It's just much more direct much more direct communication.
Mm-hmm.
And we're now so used to this kind of idea that there are
Yeah.
things behind or they need to be decoded. But you could wonder how their general understanding of meaning making was before
Before that, right?
Yeah.
And we were trained in school, right? With, for instance, in poetry, like you have these two lines of poem, and then at least in my, training, we had to write like 2 pages of interpretation, like what would the author meant probably at that time in that context, right? And every student would have a different interpretation, and that's the reason we have like 10,000 PhD theses on, or maybe 100,000, I don't know how many, on Shakespeare, right? So, so yeah, you're right. I mean, text led to all those interpretive, uh, ghostly processes.
But maybe can I ask you a question though? So do
Yeah.
you feel like it's worthwhile to keep doing the critical work? So I sometimes have this mode that I can sit down and be critical and continue that kind of critical writing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, some other people I think might say, I've also talked to some people who said, well, it's not a productive way of continue, or I don't know. How do you deal with that, or how?
So here's the thing. It's a question I struggle with myself, right? So there are two aspects to that. One is sociological aspect of it, whereas when you are critical of something, you are making enemies and less friends, right? So that's basically one criticism of doing critical work. We're critical of concepts. Once in a while, I can be critical of a researcher as well, but mostly critical of concepts. And the second is that you better spend that time in making something constructive, right? That's the second aspect. I kind of agree to it for the most part. There's an awesome book called The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, right, by Mark Manson. Like there, you have only so many fucks in life, and you have to be very careful who do you give it to and for what, right? So I kind of agree with that. Uh, and that's the reason picking, like finding flaws in papers and picking, on like small things is not worthwhile. But when it comes to mega theoretical frameworks, which basically determine, the whole trajectory of the fields along with the funding, I think as you know, as academics, we also have some responsibility to respond to overarching encroachment of the academic enterprise. I used to be, bearish on those articles before. I used to love reading them. I mean, and if you look at the history of evolutionary science, for instance, the article by Stephen Jay Gould and his colleague on, the arches and their evolution does not always lead to you cannot interpret every evolutionary or every evolved feature as something serving a purpose, right? In the past, one of the historical articles, most of the science which I learned was not from these routine articles, but from those critical articles. Those were landmark articles, right? And those people did some critical work. It's just that we did not find them to be rebel or to be critical because they were sitting at much prestigious places at that point, and they had big credentials or history of good work before they went critical, about certain concepts. And they were not like whining about every damn concept. It was placed in a few years they will put out a piece which was critical about certain things. Uh, so now but now I feel that there are some framework, especially in cognitive neuroscience, which it's a from a Popperian scientific sense, I find them borderline. Uh, I mean, I won't say intentional fraud, but they are on the verge of dishonesty because a lot of things are basically not just applicable. They're biologically untenable, and they propagate a kind of academic success and uh, a academic drift rather than actual truth. And the challenge is that they have gone into this mind washing zone where graduate students they take them as absolute because they're coming from high authority. So in that case, I think the literature needs something which is very blatant about the flaws in those concepts, so that at least some people who discover those in the early stages are basically distracted from those and actually can put their their own stuff or own brain resources into more productive enterprise. So I see there is some downside to that where you know a lot of people will not hire me or give me grants because I've written something negative about some framework. And it's not negative because I'm not saying that the framework is like bullshit. I'm just saying that it's not tenable. It's very biologically not possible, and none of the arguments hold. But at the same time, it gives me a sense of uh, belonging to truth. So I could have gone in the industry and I could have gone, somewhere else and made more money, right? I chose to be an academic, to live the way I live, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of money cost to being an academic and there's a lot of social cost to being an academic because, you have so much more work. You don't work from 9 to 5. You're constantly non-stop working and thinking, right? There's a cost to relationships. So once I've already paid that cost, I made that choice, then why should I restrict myself for a little more success, right? What would it lead to? Probably a little less grants. It will lead to less, invitation for conferences or less sociological benefits. But those were never the benefits which I looked up to begin with, right?
Yeah.
So now I have made myself comfortable and I'm very bullish about, putting up those pieces, at least in certain areas, where when I find myself, when I value myself more than me, which is when I look at the collective of the enterprise, then I feel much more positive in that, uh, you know, at the meta level, than the price I'm paying myself for it. And I'm paying the price. I have paid the price, okay, of some of those critical articles. So I don't recommend it to everyone, but there are some people who have shown support. And the amount of emails I get from people secretly admiring those and basically thankfully that I have put out those pieces in the last few years. I have like a whole like hundreds of emails, right? So
Yeah, and I
I
found them super helpful, and
yeah,
I think also that uh, yeah, I share exactly what you're saying, that
yeah.
that's part of why you are here, right? So if you
Hmm.
kind of forsaken that, what are we even doing?
Yeah.
Uh, yeah. But it does take a amount of bravery that I guess I don't always have, or I don't
Hmm.
know. But it's interesting, or it's nice to hear how you see this,
Hmm.
because it does take a toll. But for
Hmm.
you, it's also just a way of aligning your values with
Right.
what
See,
you're doing.
I was taught in a very Popperian fashion, falsifiability and science as a self-correcting process. Now, science works as a self-correcting process in an ideal world where there's no hierarchy, there is no, institutional advantage. But when you have systems where there can be some institutions and individuals who can bombard the literature with so much of nonsense in such a short amount of time, in that case, that self-correcting process will not work. Okay. And also in science as a community, there's no municipal corporation which will come to clean your road and clean your house, right? There's no body governing. There's no governance in science, to be honest. It's a very voluntary, very distributed system. So some people have to take off the broom and basically clean things once in a while, or at least try to. And they might get dirty themselves, So of course, when you clean, some shit will come on your face as well. So,
Yeah, you even might
you
be
know,
wrong, right? So it doesn't
and
that has a
yeah,
role. It has
yeah,
puts energy into a system that needs to move forward by
right,
being far from
yeah.
equilibrium, as you should say it.
And
Yeah.
one other thing which happened very lately, I mean, in the last 5 years. So as PhD students, as an undergrad, you look up to these scientists, right? A lot of those scientists, right? Like you consider them as like superhuman beings in some ways, right? And then as you grow more and you realize that all of those are basically like human beings and simple and with a lot of flaws. And once you are into science, you realize that some of those are actually not heroes because they stuck to the same framework and they did the same work all their life. It was just the volume and not the ideas, right? So you get accustomed to these new kind of realities of scientific lives, and the impact they make. That's when you realize that how small the life is. I mean, yes, it is like 30, 40 years of academic career, but it's not so much if you think about it. It is, like I'm 36 right now. Let's say I did science till 66, in an ideal world. So 30 years, that's basically six PhD, six non-overlapping PhD students,
Yeah,
right?
couple of grants and that's it. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's all I have got.
Yeah.
So if that's all I've got, do I really need to play some game where I can get a little extra funding and a little extra praise by not being critical? Or do I just go with whatever I feel and, this is the only time I have to make whatever impact I can make. So then
Yeah.
things change a little bit. So lately I have been feeling that mortality of the scientific lives, that how short-lived and how ephemeral they are compared to what grows in science in 30 years, not much.
Yeah.
You know, as you discovered in 40 years, you discovered the same phenomena.
Yeah.
So, but in technology world, a lot has changed in 40 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, so yeah, I mean, those were some of the few thoughts. I keep struggling myself with those things, and I have some mentors who tell me not to do that as well. But there's
Well,
something
I'm
about,
just saying this because I also have this proclivity of
yeah,
sometimes wanting to write something because I feel
yeah,
uh, that what is it? The king has no clothes,
uh-huh.
and before you know it, you also start to be a little bit more known in your field yourself. And I'm always a little bit afraid that I am going to protect something that I thought was something that I
Yeah,
worked
so
hard
that's
for.
fine.
Or
Just
I'm
be
also afraid to be corrupted in some way.
I'm very open about that. Like when I'm
Mm.
65 and some kid says somewhere from, a page don't write an article that Madhur Mangalam is naked. I mean, he has no clothes. I'm like, okay, man, I'm retiring. Don't worry. You carry on the science. Like I don't consider myself as like, I don't want to be the king of science. Okay. We all are
Yeah,
born naked and we all
yeah,
will die naked. I mean, in a metaphorical sense. No matter how fancy clothes we wear, during the time we are here.
yeah,
So that's my take. I'm not tied to my
yeah,
ideas, you know.
yeah.
Uh, that's
Yeah,
a
maybe I
that's
should
a
talk to you when I have to muster some courage for something.
sure. I mean, that's one thing I have a lot.
Yeah,
Okay,
sure.
and I'm willing to be wrong. Like if 5 years, I mean we discussed with Louis Favela in last podcast. One of the problems with science is that we don't reward failure. We say that we reward failure, but we don't. I think we should have $1 million grants for 50-year-old professors to come out saying that everything I did was wrong, but I want to start scratch with a new theory, and you get $1 million grant. Okay, because we don't have that, we are so afraid to acknowledge that what we did was wrong, and we carry on the same framework because there's no reward. There's all the penalties as an enterprise, but no reward to basically say that I was wrong at the meta level in my premise at some point. You know,
No, I agree. Yeah, yeah,
so we should be allowing those transformations and promote those and respect those.
I agree.
Like being a computational scientist for like 30 years and then I want to be Gibsonian, we should welcome with like you know, like this. Same for the Gibsonian, if you want to convert to a computational scientist like at 66, I mean,
Yeah,
you're welcome, and we should have a farewell party as well.
agree.
So, yeah. Any other thoughts, Wim, you would like to cover before we wrap up this fascinating episode?
No, I think or at least I enjoyed talking to you and having some perspectives from your side too. Yeah.
So thanks, Wim, for coming to BeyondPhrenology. I will be posting this soon, and I'll also put some links to your fascinating papers and hopefully talk to you again and read more of your cool work.
Yeah, I hope to see you soon in person.
Yeah. Bye. Have a great
Dude.
evening.